Greetings, my lovelies. This is Blake here, and welcome to my review of Everest. And yes, I am perfectly aware that I am a week late to this party. It's just that last week I wanted to see The Maze Runner 2 more than this, and the only new release this week was Green Inferno, but I was going to the theaters with my father, and I don't think he'd appreciate the kind of movie Green Inferno is obviously going to be. I'm not even sure I'll appreciate the kind of movie that it's obviously going to be. So we settled on Everest. And now that I've seen it, I actually regret that I chose The Maze Runner 2 over this, because Everest is a good movie. It's much better than The Scorched Trials, and I don't think I'd call it great, and I'll discuss why in a moment. I'm not even sure I'd call it especially memorable. In a lot of ways, all of the Everest movies that I've seen tend to be very much alike. I don't know if it's because most of these stories are based off of real life events, but I'm sure in a couple of years I'll struggle with differentiating this from the others. But it's still really good, and it's worth watching at least once. For one, the director does a phenomenal job at making you feel like these characters are on Everest, and even more importantly, it makes you feel like you're on Everest with them. I started feeling like I was getting cold, that I needed a jacket, and then I remembered, wait, it's Arizona, and it's still technically in the summer. So if anything, I'll probably be one of those guys stripping off my clothing. If you've seen the movie, you'll know what I'm referring to. But the cinematography was amazing. These sets or locations, I'm not really sure how they filmed this. I know they probably did not haul these big name actors to Mount Everest, but either they, did some incredible set design, or they found another mountain that they could pass off as Everest. Either way, these locations were gorgeous, but at the same time, the director did a phenomenal job at casting a sinister light on this beauty. There's always this feeling of impending doom sneaking up, on these characters, and that really kind of heightened the suspense. Now, on that note, this film definitely utilizes a very slow burn style of suspense. Throughout the first half of the movie, very little action happens. I think there's only like one close call. You're spending this time learning about the characters, learning about the dangers of Mount Everest. In fact, really, this is an ensemble piece. There is no true protagonist. The closest one I could think of is the mountain itself. And that was an interesting way of telling this story. There are both strengths and flaws which benefit it, and I'll get into that in a little bit too. Really, I don't think any true action happened until like the last 30-40 minutes or so. But once it does, wow, it was very intense, and despite being based off a true story, I never found it to be tasteless, and yet it's also not clinical either. It's tragic, and you really feel that tragedy, but it's also, terrifying, and even though it took quite some time to get going, I was never bored. The real problem with this movie is the characterizations are very cookie cutter. They take one attribute per character and then they kind of roll with it. So in the case of Josh Brolin's character, he's kind of the stereotypical rich Texan. Not unlikable, but still, all the character traits we've seen done a million times before. Now, I don't know if that's how the character was or the person was in real life, but it's still cinematically very familiar. And with everybody else, one guy has a pregnant wife waiting at home. Now, afterwards, I had heard about this story, but I had forgotten most of it. I remember seeing that IMAX Everest film that came out in the 90s, I believe. And I don't remember too much of it, but I remember bits and pieces here and there, but still, I had forgotten how really Hollywoodish the true story is. Certain things that you'd think the movie made up for the sake of being more compelling actually did happen in real life. As once again, as Hollywoodish as it sounds, in terms of certain pieces of dialogue or certain events. In fact, if anything, I think the film toned down the real story just because it seemed like it would be too absurd to be true. But so I don't know how these people were in real life. All I know is that they took cliches and they pretty much made that the embodiment of the character, and that's why I can't call Everest great. Now, on the other hand, the cast does such a great job, and this is definitely a true ensemble piece with lots of big name actors playing these roles: Jason Clarke, Josh Brolin, Sam Worthington, Jake Gyllenhaal, Keira Knightley, and a few other people who you might not recognize their names, but you'll at least recognize their faces. You've seen them before on many other things, and that's cool because this really felt like a true throwback to the disaster flick that was popular in the 70s. I don't count Roland Emmerich's films to be part of that mold simply because Roland Emmerich's movies were always so hokey. I never felt like this one was trying to be campy or goofy. It's very grim. It is very much a dramatic thriller. But that's more in line with the kinds of films that would come out in the 70s, whether it was Airport, The Towering Inferno, Poseidon Adventure. You might look upon those movies now and think they were a little campy, whether it was the fashion trends or whatever, but they were intended to be taken seriously, and so is Everest, and I had no problem taking it seriously. I didn't like how the character arcs were explained through exposition. That's always just a little lazy to me. But I also liked how you never really knew who would die or who would live, unless like you're really familiar with what actually happened and you memorized the names. I obviously didn't. So there are a few deaths that did catch me off guard, even though in retrospect they probably shouldn't have. But it's an ingenious way of building suspense when you have characters who obviously aren't going to survive, but they're played by big enough stars, so you kind of expect them to at least live longer anyway. So that was cool. And really, overall, I'd just say Everest was a good movie. The problem with, like, I don't know if it's still playing in IMAX. I don't know if it was, I think it was initially released in IMAX, but I don't know how financially successful this film has been. But I think that if I had seen it on IMAX, the experience would have been significantly greater. But at the same time, I don't know if this film was great enough to warrant me spending the money to see it on IMAX. It's one of those, it's debatable, I guess, just how much money I'm willing to spend that day. So keep that in mind. If you don't mind shilling out the extra cash for the much grander experience and it happens to be playing in an IMAX near you, sure, go see it in an IMAX theaters. If you're a more economical spender and you just don't have the money to really throw it around into the IMAX theaters, I'd still say that this is worth seeing in theaters, but IMAX is purely optional. So that is all I have to say. Personally, I would have focused more on developing, 2 or 3 characters, and then just have everybody else be, significant to the story, and they're played by, a big name star. But at the same time, don't feel the need to develop everybody, because you're just kind of going to underwhelm the viewer in that area. I think Airport and Towering Inferno and Poseidon Adventure are once again, they did that a lot better. They developed a few characters, but then like everybody else was still important, but they didn't really feel the need to spend too much time in fleshing them out. But here they try to develop everybody, and it just, some of the relationships I thought were unclear. Like, what was Sam Worthington's tie to Jason Clarke's character? Maybe they explained that, but it must have been just so abrupt that I couldn't really keep up. So this film could have definitely done some things better, but it excels in the areas that it wants to excel. And visually, this film is definitely a marvel, but it's not just style over substance too. It does do a good job at making you care for the characters. Maybe it's just because it's a true story that when somebody dies, you really feel that sting, and that is impressive. There's so many things that go into making a good movie, and this film succeeded in all the areas it needed to succeed to be good. Even if it wasn't anything, it's not going to be remembered as a classic. So that's all I have to say. I did not do a written review of this. I have done written reviews of House of Traps, a kung fu movie starring the Venom Mob, The Brood, a David Cronenberg flick, The Visit by M. Night Shyamalan. My next one, actually this is going to be a busy week because I'll see The Martian Friday, but sometime between now and then I plan on seeing Green Inferno and on Attack on Titan. If I can. I can't promise anything, but I'm going to try. And if I do, those will be the next movies. I've also written one for Star Wars Episode 3, but it probably won't be released until after I've taken care of these films. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter. Also check out my review of WWE's Night of Champions, and I will see you guys later. Hey everybody, this is Blake here, and that cupboard is open. Sorry, that's like a weird pet peeve of mine. I can't stand seeing that crap open. Where was I?